not gonna lie, I absolutely hate vintage motorcycle museum videos. I don't find them very interesting. However, in true Whitney Does fashion, I found the closest museum to me, which is in Johnson City, Texas, is not just any run-of-the-mill museum owned by some faceless entity. It's actually owned by a whistleblower, and it's part of the reason he has acquired so many bikes. So let's go in and talk to Gordon and hear his awesome story. Gordon, I am so glad you handed this to me. I feel like I've come across a treasure trove a little bit. Not only are you a motorcycle collector and vintage bike enthusiast, but you're a whistleblower for corporate greed.
Yes. Back in 2005, I blew the whistle on fraud that was occurring within the company that I worked for, a company by the name of AIG.
That's beautiful. Now, I know that there's some controversy about this. You have a blog and you've recently released this story on your blog.
Yes.
There's some controversy behind that, but I love this. I love this so much because to me, the American way is the whistleblower. Personally, I think that's the most patriotic thing you can do. It's probably not a common ethical vibe for most people, but they were essentially retaliating against you for whistleblowing, which left you jobless and you had a ton of time on your hands and you could retire.
Well, I reached an out-of-court settlement with AIG in 2005. I was alleging that they were retaliated against me because I blew the whistle on accounting fraud.
And you had proof of that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
oh,
you,
yes.
you had proof, like substantial proof of like, hey, they are actually.
It was to the tune of about $2 billion.
Wow.
That they were misaccounting for. And I was responsible for the department that accounting of fraud occurred in. And I had no involvement in the fraud, but nonetheless, I ran the department. And at the time, I was deciding what I should do with that information. One of my friends and neighbors was the former chief accounting officer at Enron. And he ended up serving 5 years at a federal penitentiary in Bastrop.
That's it?
5 years. And I looked at my situation at AIG and thought, I don't want to spend 5 years in any federal penitentiary.
So you had a real life example occurring in front of you of another unrelated to your paradigm storyline of fraud.
Yes.
So you were kind of getting a hint from the universe to be like, oh, see this guy?
Well, this guy was a friend of mine, and he was a very senior executive with Enron, and he had a very lavish corporate lifestyle, living in a beautiful home and having all the trappings of wealth. And then after Enron blew itself up, his life consisted of nothing but going to indictments and trials and hearings and pleading his legal case and eventually losing and having to serve time in prison. And my heart went out to the guy because I knew him personally. But the last thing in the world I ever wanted to do was see that being my future.
No, absolutely not.
Plus, I felt it was the moral thing to do to blow the whistle on the fraud. So in 2005, I did that. I wrote a memo which went both inside the company and outside the company. And
is there a system? Did you have to contact the media, or what was your system?
I followed the company's code of ethics on how a whistleblower should report their information.
So that was in their code of ethics?
Yes. In fact, at the time, AIG was strongly encouraging anybody to come forward who knew of accounting irregularities, because AIG was very much in the press at the time for other accounting irregularities. So I kind of felt like I was doing the right thing from a lot of different vantage points.
Well, how dare you?
But after I blew the whistle, AIG began a campaign of retaliation against me, and ultimately I was fired in 2005.
Was that shocking to you, to be fired?
Oh, I knew it was coming.
You knew it was coming. You're
Yeah.
like, okay, I'm writing the memo. This is definitely probably what's
Yeah.
going to happen.
It was damage control after that.
And so afterwards, you said you worked there for 5 more months, and they started, taking responsibilities away
Yeah.
from you, doing all that stuff, kind of pushing you out.
I started getting blamed for problems I had no involvement in. I was left out of meetings. I was kind of put up on a little bit of a pedestal as an example of somebody, of what somebody shouldn't do within that organization.
They shouldn't follow the AIG code of ethics.
Right.
Yeah.
But this was AIG's way of communicating that. And eventually I got fired, but soon after, I was working in New York at the time, and soon after being fired, I hired a great guy. I describe him to his face, the cockiest, most arrogant New York Park Avenue lawyer that money could buy. And he was the kind of guy that was a real scrapper. He wasn't afraid to go after AIG. And we threatened legal action against AIG for retaliation, which is completely forbidden to retaliate against a whistleblower. And they really didn't have a case of defense because I had all kinds of documentation for how they had treated me. And so we reached an out-of-court settlement in late 2005.
So you avoided going to court a lot, playing the game, tying up your life in the courtroom, and they settled. Mm-hmm. And what did you do with the settlement money? Did you have kind of like a crisis, like an identity crisis a little bit? I could see how working full-time for a large company like that and suddenly finding yourself with an honest way to make money. You got punished for being honest, but ultimately you prepared for that. You hired the right guy.
Well, it was a huge emotional change for me. I'd been used to working 60, 70 hours a week for 30 years. I had a position that was a fairly high position within AIG, and all of a sudden that was gone. And that can be very difficult for some of us who are used to being in a position of power and influence to suddenly have all that taken away. But I did receive a large financial settlement, and suddenly I had a completely empty calendar on my hand. And after the initial shock and awe of that kind of wore off, I began to realize that I'd always had a passion for old motorcycles.
But you never had time.
I didn't have time to restore them as much as I wanted to, or to ride them as much as I wanted to. So suddenly at the age of 54, I was in a position where I could take the rest of my life off and do whatever I damn well pleased.
And now we all get to bask in the beautiful glow of post-whistleblower life and somebody who has a passion for bikes, much like I did. So I'm sure it starts with you. How many did you have before the settlement? Did you have some bikes?
I think I had maybe 10. I
Oh
had
my gosh, you
motorcycles
had 10
all my life.
You had 10 bikes in the garage while you were working?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's a lot.
Well, I'm living proof that one can never have too many motorcycles.
That's true, yeah.
But given the time that I suddenly had available and the financial settlement that I had, and I'd been in the investment business all my career, so I began to look at classic motorcycles also in terms of their investment quality. I loved them. I loved to ride them. I loved to restore them. I loved to collect them. But the hidden benefit was that they've gone up in value quite a bit over the last 20 years.
I see what's going on here, because the reason why I wanted to interview you is I came in here, we were out doing in-law stuff, but I asked you, I was like, okay, I gotta ask, what's your favorite bike in here? And you pointed to, is it a 2017 Africa Twin?
Yeah.
You pointed to that Africa Twin, you're like, that's my favorite bike. And I was like, right answer. Like, that's the absolute right answer. That sounds like somebody who's been spending most of their life restoring vintage motorcycles would say. I like the fuel injected one. I like the one that starts up right away and doesn't have any esoteric carb problems.
Well, the truth is that my motorcycles here at the museum are almost entirely from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And that was really the golden era of motorcycles, when the Japanese came in and dramatically changed the industry. And there was a tremendous number of very interesting motorcycles built and sold during that time period. But the reality is the technology of these motorcycles goes back 50 years or so. And they're rough, they vibrate, they leak, they don't always start, they have finicky electrics, carbs are not very reliable. So if I'm gonna get out and ride for the day and really enjoy being on a motorcycle,
You're reaching for the Africa
I want the
Twin.
newer bike.
That's why the museum is kind of like the perfect place for it. It's like you get to appreciate the aesthetics and also the engineering. You know, a lot of people are looking at the engines, but you don't have to deal with dailying it every day or trying to go on a big long ride with some late 60s Norton or something.
Well, people often ask me how many of the motorcycles in the museum actually run, and virtually all of them are set up for long-term storage, but once set up fairly quickly, 90% of them will run. But if I had to keep them all set up and ready to ride, I would have no other life.
No, that sounds kind of hellish a little bit.
So we keep them pretty much as long-term museum pieces.
What do you notice in the museum getting the most attention? Or since you are set up for antique bikes, you see a little bit of everything?
People who are motorcyclists, which are probably 2/3 of my guests, really want to focus on the motorcycles they had when they were young.
Oh yeah, they want to come and take a nice little nostalgic dump.
I have a little 1969 Honda Z50, and that little bike garners more attention because so many people either had one or they wanted one, and they have tremendous memories of it. So that kind of motorcycle provides a great deal of value for our customers.
Right.
But then there's a very strong interest in some of the old military bikes. I have a Cushman, an Indian, and a old Harley that are all military bikes, former military bikes. And a lot of the folks are really drawn to those bikes because of the historical value. I have a Manx Norton factory road racer that was raced at the Isle of Man, which is very prominent in my collection, and that one always garners a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But what I pride myself on, I guess, more than anything else, is just the variety. I have motorcycles that are from all over the world, covering many, many decades.
And you've acquired these bikes through all sorts of facets, right? Like Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, eBay.
And just sometimes driving through small towns and asking questions and trying to build a network of fellow collectors and private salvage yards and independent motorcycle shops. There's a lot of trial and error, but sometimes it's the search and finding that's the best part.
I was about to say, is that your favorite part or your least favorite part?
Sometimes it's kind of both. It depends on how lucky you are in finding what you want to find. Sometimes you can drive for days and days and driving through small towns and talking to people, and you don't really find anything you're that excited about. But other times you can walk into a garage or a barn, and it just becomes like Christmas morning with all the bikes that someone has collected over the years.
What about, as somebody who's restoed bikes before, finding parts? What's like your favorite, do you have any favorite stories of like coming across a gold mine? Or have they been pretty easy to acquire? Have they been really hard in the last 3 years?
It's all over the map, and it has a lot to do with the original popularity of the motorcycle that you're trying to restore. If it's a Honda, Yamaha, Harley, parts are going to be more available than some of the more rare brands, such as a Bultaco or a Velocette. Those were not made in large numbers to begin with, and they can be very difficult to find parts for. If I'm looking at buying a motorcycle that I'm not that familiar with in terms of their parts availability, I right away get on eBay and just type in whatever brand it is and just see what's available. And if you don't see too many sellers of parts for the bike that you own, you have to assume that parts are going to be very difficult.
Does that stop you from making a purchase?
Not necessarily, because it all depends on how many parts a restoration might need. I actually found a 1957 Zundap 200S here in the Dripping Springs area, which I've restored and is now in the museum. And I found a lot of parts actually in Nuremberg, Germany, just by contacting some of the eBay sellers that had other parts for sale. I just contacted a few guys and I just said, what else you got for a 1957 Zundap? And in many cases, they had piles of parts and they were very anxious to sell them.
Yeah, luckily it's like if you find somebody with a box of parts, the chances are they've got a lot.
Often that's the case,
yeah. Tapping the underbelly of the collectors is like kind of where I remember being totally shocked by some people being like, this unmarked warehouse is just filled to the brim with parts. I mean, those people who collect parts just happen to be some of the most valuable people you ever meet.
But there are sellers online of new old stock parts and some reproduction parts, and it's always important to check out those sources and look at their catalog. Oftentimes, parts catalogs for older bikes can have a pretty skimpy selection. It can be very difficult to find original sheet metal or engine cases or things like that. You can oftentimes find points and condensers and chains and cables and things like that. Hardest parts often are the internal engine parts and then the body parts.
How many of these bikes are actually yours? Oh wait, you recently just acquired your 100th bike.
Well, I acquired my 84th bike that I own, and we have 16 loaners from other people that I'm very, very grateful for. So that brings us up to 100.
Wow. What was the 100th? What was the last
The
loaner
100th
bike?
bike was a bike I just finished restoring. It's a 1972 Osa Pioneer, a Spanish bike.
Osa.
There were actually 3 famous Spanish brands back in the 60s and 70s, Osa, Montesa, and Voltaco. And the Spanish industry was very vibrant during that time period until the Japanese came along and just outproduced the Spanish makers, and they have all since faded into oblivion.
So it was the Japanese manufacturing that kind of decimated the diversity when it came to the vintage market?
In many cases, the bikes I own are the victims of the Japanese industry. I mean, in defense of the Japanese, they produced a far superior product in terms of technology. They had better dealer networks, they had better warranties, they had better reliability, and they sold a gazillion motorcycles. And in the case of the British industry, it was entirely bankrupt by 1980. And companies like Harley-Davidson barely survived, Ducati barely survived, BMW barely survived. But I think the effect of the Japanese industry was really to create the modern motorcycle industry. Because before the Japanese came along, motorcycles were pretty rough.
Were they significantly more expensive?
The Japanese?
The brands before the Japanese.
The Japanese generally undercut all the existing makers.
I could see that that's what's going to really...
They could produce in volume, and at the time they had lower manufacturing costs, they had more modern manufacturing techniques. But it's still great to see these brands that did fall prey to the Japanese to continue to have a presence in the history.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of bikes, you've brought up 2 I've never heard of. I mean, it's cool to hear, especially vintage Spanish bikes. You know, when I was growing up, I heard about all the UK bikes, and that was kind of like what was prevalent in the books I was reading and stuff, but not really the Spanish ones. So, except for Voltaco, like that one was pretty popular.
They were almost entirely dirt bikes. They did make some street bikes, and I've tried to focus my collecting on those street bikes. But we probably don't hear about them as much because they were mostly specialty dirt bikes.
Favorite vintage bike? I actually didn't ask you this. I asked you your favorite bike, you gave me the Africa Twin, but favorite vintage bike?
I have a beautifully restored 1974 Moto Guzzi V7 Sport that to me is the quintessential Italian cafe racer. That is the bike that kind of catches my eye more than any other one.
It's got that lure. It's got
Yes.
that ineffable quality and pull to
Yes.
it. Well, thanks so much. I love your story. I love that everybody. I feel like people have vintage bikes and they want to show it off. They want to find somebody like you who's going to set it up, put it in a safe space, and other people can look at it, versus sitting in sitting in a garage collecting dust.
Well, that's how I was collecting before I found this building. I had a whole bunch of motorcycles in 2-3 car garages, and it was fun to collect, but at the end of the day, very few people saw the bikes, and they were often just tucked away in a corner covered with dust. And having the museum gives me the opportunity to show everybody what I prize and what I've collected over the years. And it also gives me an opportunity to have a connection with the community.
Yeah. And your daughter helps you.
My daughter does all my social media. And
It's a family business.
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
I almost feel like you're running out of room. Do you feel like you're running out of room?
I have pretty much reached capacity.
I'm just looking around being like, you know what? There's not much space to walk.
Well, there is space. I want to keep enough space around each bike so that people can see the bike and take photographs, maybe pose with the bike. I don't want to get so many bikes smushed in together that it's like a showroom where the bikes are just lined up one right next to each other.
Do you feel satiated with 100? Is that like a good number to?
I think it's a good number.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I do hope to keep some of the loaner bikes coming in and replacing them with older loaner bikes, and kind of using that as a way of keeping my collection fresher. Plus, I may, at the end of the day, start selling a few bikes now that I'm at capacity, and that gives me a chance to maybe buy some different bikes that I might find more collectible.
Right. So even though you've hit 100, you're still kind of like, well,
It's not going to be a static one.
no, you're right. That would be that would get stale after a little while. Well, thanks so much for joining me and getting to share your story. And what a little gem. I rent out my motorcycles to try to send everybody your way. It's a beautiful ride out here. It hasn't been good riding weather, and
Oh, it's been so dry. It just breaks my heart because this is the best time of year. Normally, it's not over 100. It might be in the 90s, but it's still tolerable. But this summer, we have just seen a tremendous drop-off in not just motorcycles, but pedestrian traffic in general.
yeah.
So we're counting the days till fall and our first rainfall.
Yeah. So if you're out in Texas and you're riding around, especially we've got Moto Americas coming in September, and then MotoGP is not until next year. But come stop by the Texas Vintage Motorcycle Museum here in Johnson City.
6,500 square feet of air-conditioned splendor.
What better place to find other comrades and have a nostalgic little rehash?
And we are also right in the heart of the hill country, and there's incredible rides all over the hill country. So I encourage everybody that's tired of Austin traffic or San Antonio traffic to come out this way, maybe spend a few days just enjoying the really incredible roads that we have here in the hill country.
Absolutely. And come say hi to Gordon. You're here every day, right?
Thursday through Sunday.
Thursday through Sunday. Come see him, and thanks again.
Thanks for coming.